Paul understands what the law says about speaking evil against an authority. He'll cite the law for the crowd. Yet, careful Bible interpreters have to grapple with the reality that what Paul does here is also what the other prophets did elsewhere. And look no further than Jesus. For Jesus did not sin when he called Herod a fox. Luke 13:32. That wasn't a compliment. And Jesus did not sin when he described the leadership of the Pharisees, many of them who sat in the council, as whitewashed tombs. Nor was John the Baptist in sin when he called the Jerusalem council, who approached him at his Jordan River baptism, by referring to them as a, quote, brood of vipers. Matthew 3, verse 7. Paul here speaks under the influence of the Spirit as God's prophet. Now, if this reading is true, how do we understand what Paul says next? Look at verse 5. Paul said, "I did not know, brothers, he was the high priest. For it is written," and here's his citation of the law, Exodus 22:28, "You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." Listen to Matthew Henry here. Paul does not go about to excuse what he had said in the least, but rather to justify it. I want you to think about that for a minute. Matthew Henry is making this argument. What Paul says here in verse 5 is actually to justify the speech that he just uttered, not to apologize. And Henry gives his own translation. Quote, Henry says that Paul is saying something like this. Quote, "I own that God's high priest is not to be reviled, but I do not own this Ananias to be high priest. He is a usurper. He came to the office by bribery and corruption, and the Jewish rabbis say that he who does so is neither a judge nor to be honored as such." End quote. Now, I'm going to go back to Calvin. Here's Calvin's explanation of verse 5. Ananias was not so obscure that Paul was ignorant of his rank. What is he saying? Calvin is saying this. Be very careful about saying Paul didn't know who he was talking to. There's one person who runs the council when the council assembles. It's the high priest. Paul knew that. He was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. Don't be quick to say, well, he hasn't been in Jerusalem in a while, so maybe he doesn't recognize him. Guy's been reigning for 10 years. He's enough up to date with the state of affairs of his people. He knows who's in power. Remember, he just returned from the temple where he was participating in a consecration ceremony with a couple of Nazarites. He may have even came face to face with this man. Back to Calvin's words. Calvin says, Ananias was not so obscure that Paul was ignorant of his rank. The fact that Paul was rebuking him for abusing his position as a judge and acting unlawfully shows that Paul knew what Ananias' position was. That type of reasoning lands very soundly on my feeble mind. Calvin then says this. This is what theologians do when they want to play the trump card. I therefore agree with Augustine that this excuse is ironical. So he's saying, having read Augustine, that he believes Augustine's interpretation is correct. Paul is being ironic here. So listen to Calvin's rendering of Paul's statement. So the meaning of Paul's statement was, quote, "Brothers, I see nothing priestly about this man," end quote.